Hi guys, it's Nick, the ASMR nerd, and today I'm going to be talking about graphics cards. It's just going to be a chill kind of chat and ramble, just like a discussion, I guess, about current news in the graphics cards world. And so if this is your thing, that's great. You can listen along. Maybe you'll find it interesting. If it's not your thing, you can just zone out. It'll be like a boring class at school. And you can just fall right to sleep. So it's a win-win all around, right? So recently, Nvidia announced a new generation of graphics cards launching soon on September 20th, 2018. And immediately, gamers got really mad. They got really upset. The internet exploded with rage, as it does. But why? Why are gamers so mad about these new cards that Nvidia has announced? Well, that's a good question. It's not an entirely simple question, and it's what we're going to be discussing at length here tonight. Now, there's a good chance that if you are watching this video, you know a thing or two about graphics cards. But I also know that there are many non-PC gamers who watch my channel. So very, very briefly, a graphics card is the part of the computer that renders the graphics that you see on the screen. That's all, basically. And it's a key component for playing modern video games with complex graphics and real-time rendering. And a more powerful graphics card can render graphics that are sharper, higher detail, just overall more realistic and lifelike. And can also render more frames in a given amount of time, like more frames per second, which makes motion feel smoother, look and feel smoother. And so for these reasons, powerful graphics cards are highly desirable for gamers. Makes a lot of sense, right? Which brings us to the graphics cards that Nvidia recently announced. Nvidia is the world's largest designer of GPUs, graphics processing units. And it's been quite some time. It's been well over 2 years since they announced a new generation of products, of graphics cards. So recently they announced the RTX 2070, 2080, and 2080 Ti. Those are the three cards that are coming first in this new generation. And Nvidia claims, of course, that these cards are very powerful and can run games at high resolutions with high details, ultra settings and all that stuff, and high frame rates as well. But that's not all these new cards are bringing to the table. The major hook, the selling point that Nvidia is really pushing is a new technology. Well, it's not really a new technology. It's new to gaming, but it's called ray tracing. And you might have heard the term being discussed in recent weeks because it is kind of a hot topic right now. And I don't have time really here to go into a big long discussion about ray tracing technology, but the TLDR version is that ray tracing will allow for much, much more accurate and realistic lighting effects, including illumination and shadowing and reflection and refraction, these kinds of things. The gist of it is that up until this point, video game engines have been doing all the lighting sort of by faking it, by using approximations and tricks and shortcuts and things to render the lighting in a scene, and it looks pretty good. We're at a point where it looks pretty darn good. Ray tracing is an entirely different approach, and it simulates the way light works in the real world, essentially. Photons bouncing off of surfaces. And so it's a physics-based light rendering system. And it might seem kind of gimmicky at first because you're like, well, better lighting, whatever, who cares? But it is the way of the future when it comes to graphics rendering. And in essence, it will allow real-time rendering on your home PC in video games to look a lot more like Hollywood special effects is really the take home here. Now, that's going to take a while. There are some caveats to this first generation of ray tracing in consumer GPUs, but there's always got to be a first step, a first generation product for a new technology. So we might talk a little bit more about ray tracing later on, once we've discussed these cards a bit more, but the essence of it is it'll make your games look better, or so they say. It will come at a performance impact as well. How much exactly, we don't know. So anyway, these cards, evidently high performance, ray tracing, all well and good. But there's a catch, of course, and the catch is that these cards are significantly more expensive than last generation's equivalent graphics cards. How much more expensive, you might ask? Well, let's just bring up something that I've prepared for you guys. Wanted to get some slides going up here, so this is like a reel. Okay, and okay, so yes, I've got a PowerPoint prepared for you. That is how soporific this video is. This is how sleep-inducing it will be, just like being in a lecture. So RTX 2070, 2080, 2080 Ti. I might have called them 270, 280, 280 Ti earlier. That was wrong. I'm tired. Anyway, they start at 500, they go to 700, they end up at 1,000. These prices are significantly more than the previous generation of video cards. So this is what the previous series looked like. This new series they're calling the GeForce 20 series, so that's down here. The previous series was the GeForce 10 series, so that's right here. So the GeForce 10 GTX 1070, which launched in 2016, came in at $380 US. That was the launch price for that card. You can get fancier versions of it that cost more, of course. And the cryptocurrency thing, that whole cryptocurrency boom, elevated the prices of many of these cards well beyond reasonable points. But the launch price in US dollars for the basic GTX 1070 was $380. Same story for the 1080 and the 1080 Ti. And you can see right away that this new GeForce 20 series is significantly more expensive than the previous generation. But what about the big picture? What if we go even further back? We need a bigger, a longer frame of reference here to know how these guys really stack up, these new card prices. So that's what I've done here. I went back, I looked on Wikipedia, and I compiled all the prices of the GeForce 1070 equivalent, a 1080 equivalent, and the 1080 Ti. And what these basically are, if you don't know, is just sort of different performance brackets. So the 70s tend to be what they call their middle high-end cards, or high-end even. The 80s are their enthusiast level cards, and that's always sort of the flagship card for the generation. And then the 80 Ti is usually sort of the highest level of performance available in a consumer grade card. After that, you get into the Titan series, and that's sort of a prosumer grade. We're not really factoring that in. Anyway, so going all the way back, and Nvidia's naming scheme is a little bit ridiculous. They went through the hundreds, and then they dropped back to what they call the 10 series, even though it's like 1070, 1080, whatever. Doesn't matter. The point is that the GeForce 200 series takes us all the way back to 2008, 2009, I believe. They launched in 2008. So we're looking at really, 11 years of graphics card history, pricing history summed up here. I'm calling it the 10-year average because it's close enough, but it's probably closer to 11. Anyway, point is that if you look at the pricing, it's fairly consistent throughout. There's a few ups and downs here in the 80s. The 280, GTX 280 in particular, was pretty pricey. But generally speaking, there's some similarities in pricing. They all cluster in the sort of $500 to $600 range. The 80 Ti's are kind of a new thing. They only started with the 700 series, so. But anyway, if you average the prices of each tier of card across the last 10 or 11 years, this is what you get. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably not thinking this at all, but you might be thinking, hold on a second, Nick, what about inflation? Well, I adjusted the prices for inflation just for you individuals who were wanting that, who are going to be pedantic about it. So, adjusted for inflation in 2018 dollars. These are the 10-year average prices for each of these performance brackets for the GeForce cards. And they come out actually kind of nicely, don't they? The XX70 cards, so whatever that is, the 970s, the 1070s, they come out right around $400 US for their launch price. The 80 series, or 80 tier, comes out right around $600 US. And the TI tier, granted only, or the 80 Ti tier, I should say, only 3 data points for that one, but it comes out around $700. So we have a reasonable precedent set by a decade or so of pricing history, with the exception of the 80 Ti's, which is a bit shorter. But now that's only part of the story, right? That's the pricing story. But let's see. Oh, okay, so let's compare that then to these newly announced GeForce RTX 20 series. So we see that the RTX 2070 is about $100 more expensive than the historical average for that tier. The RTX 2080 is similarly about $100 more expensive than the historical average for that tier. The 2080 Ti is right out to lunch at about $300 more expensive than the historical average for its tier, performance tier. And I should point out, you might have seen some other prices floating around for these RTX series cards. Nvidia has what they call the Founders Edition, which is their own edition of the card that they put out. It's the kind of what you get if you pre-order, basically. And then other third-party companies will come up with their designs afterwards. And those other designs will be starting at these prices. But Nvidia's Founders Edition cards are actually priced higher than this. So the Founders Edition 2080 Ti is $1,200. And I believe it's the 2080 is $800, the Founders Edition, I should say. And the 2070 Founders Edition is $600 or something. Anyway, doesn't really matter. I'm not considering the Founders Editions here because they're not going to be good value regardless. But these are the MSRP, the base launch prices that we're looking at and considering here. That was a little bit of an aside. The point is that these cards are significantly more expensive across the board than the historical average price in each performance bracket. But pricing is only part of the story, right? Performance is the other important part. So here we have a similar look at performance over the years. And what these numbers are is relative performance gain over each previous generation. So, for instance, if we're starting with the 280, as the baseline here, the GTX 480 was 56% faster than the 280. There's a few important details here. These numbers come from Tech PowerUp's GPU database. Their performance summary, which is an average across a bunch of games in their test suite. And of course, those games have changed over the years. But they're broadly representative at the time that that card was benchmarked of the kinds of games that were being played or that were popular. And these benchmark numbers are all for 1080p resolution. So what we see is that there's kind of a big jump between the 200 and 400 series. There was a 300 series in there, but it was basically a rebranded 200 series, and there was no high-end cards for it. There was no 370, 380, 380 Ti. They never existed, so we ignored that. Same with the 800 series. There was never any high-end cards for the 800 series. Why Nvidia skips numbers, like, sometimes I don't know. They just do. Who knows what their rationale is, but anyway. So the point is that it's kind of been a variable, hasn't it? Here, the 200 to 400 series jump was significant. For the next three series, the 5, the 6, the 700 series, much smaller jumps in around the order of 25% performance gain over the previous generation's equivalent card. Uh, 900 series was a little bit more, and then the GeForce 10 series was exceptional, in that it was the single biggest jump in performance that we've seen in over a decade, generation over generation anyway. We see that the 1070 was 55% faster than the 970. The 1080 was a whopping 60% faster, and the same goes for the 1080 Ti over the 980 Ti. But given that that was exceptional, if we want a more representative look at the performance history of these cards, performance increases generation on generation, we can average them, and these are the numbers that we arrive at. So, generation over generation, on average, the 770 tier cards are about 35% faster than their predecessors. Similarly, generation over generation, the 80 tier cards are about 38% faster. And over here, the 80 Ti tier cards are about 47% faster each generation over the previous one. Not nearly as many data points there. But the important part is that we can get a good sense of sort of the average expected increase from one generation to the next within a performance tier for Nvidia's high-end cards here. And this is averaged over, again, 10 to 11 years. So let's now take a look, assuming, knowing these averages, these average performance increases, and knowing the pricing of this upcoming RTX 20 generation, we can do some quick maths and come up with these numbers. The performance gain required to justify the price increase that we're seeing. So this takes into account the fact that these cards are more expensive, and based on the average pricing for each tier and the average generation over generation performance increase, we can conclude that the RTX 2070 will need to be about 44% faster on average than the GTX 1070 for the RTX 2070 to be of reasonable value, in line with the last decade of graphics cards. Likewise, the RTX 2080 will need to be about 43% faster than the GTX 1080 to maintain that average. And the RTX 2080 Ti will need to be about 65% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti. And that is due to, of course, that massive price increase generation over generation. So the question then becomes, are these numbers attainable? Is it reasonable to expect that we will see these kinds of performance gains with the GeForce RTX 20 series? And I think the answer is yeah, actually. Having run the numbers, looked at the math, when we look at, especially in the context of the GeForce 10 series, the step from the 900 series to the 10 series, we're looking at numbers that are in that neighborhood or higher. And even if we look at the average over the last decade, it's not, outside of the realm of possibility, I guess, is what I'm getting at. But the challenge here is that we don't have any performance numbers for the GeForce RTX 20 series, except for one slide provided to us by Nvidia. And of course, Nvidia is going to cherry pick their benchmarks to show their new cards in the best light possible. And we only have it for the 2080 card, but let's take a look anyway. So this slide is from Nvidia, and of course, once the review embargo is up, then we'll have all kinds of independent benchmarks from a variety of games, and this will no longer be a mystery. But right now, what we have is this, and these are a series of games that Nvidia has selected. They were measured at 4K, so this is not a perfect comparison to the 1080p benchmarks that we were looking at a moment ago, but this is what we have to work with. And it's showing us the RTX 2080 versus the GTX 1080. And what we're seeing here is a kind of a strange normalized graph, where instead of showing us frames per second or anything, it's just saying if the GTX 1080's performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for instance, is whatever, then this is the factor by which the 2080 is faster. These dark green bars here are what we want to be looking at, really. These bright yellow, I'm so colorblind. I guess they're not yellow, they're bright green. We're gonna say they're bright green. These bright colored bars on top here are something else entirely. They're showing performance with Nvidia's new DLSS technology, which is a AI-powered upscaling technique, and we have yet to see what that looks like in action. It will allow for much greater performance, but it's not true 4K in this case. This will be some other lower resolution upscaled to 4K. So ignore those parts of the bars for now. Just look at the dark green part here. And what we see is that the GTX, or the RTX 2080, excuse me, is achieving pretty close to, on average, a 50%, 1.5 times performance increase over the GTX 1080. And if we go back and look at what it needs to hit in order to maintain that, historically average level of generation over generation performance increase, factoring in its price increase, it needs to hit that 43% on average. And I'd say if these benchmarks are representative, I'd say it's pretty darn close. So ultimately what this comes down to is, can Nvidia justify these price increases? And with the very limited data that we've been presented with so far, I'd say it's on target to do so. I think that for the RTX 2070 and the RTX 2080, I think that they will be reasonable value cards in the context of the last 10 or so years of Nvidia's high-end graphics card pricing and performance. The 2080 Ti might be a stretch. They have increased the price dramatically over the previous generations, or previous, few generations at least. And I don't know if we're going to see a 65% increase over the GTX 1080 Ti's performance. If so, that would be quite exceptional. Now, the last aspect of all this is this ray tracing, the value of ray tracing. Is it a gimmick? Is it necessary? You know, does it add extra value to these cards above and beyond their standard performance? And the answer there is we don't know yet. But there's a couple of important points. One is that at the time the GeForce RTX 20 series launches, there will be no games that take advantage of the RTX technology. Now, Nvidia has a list of about 20 games, I think, that are going to support RTX or ray tracing, and there will be undoubtedly more to come in future. But at the time of launch, none of those games will exist, and unfortunately, this technology is not something that is backwards compatible, which is to say, engines have to have RTX support programmed into them. The game has to have it programmed in. It's not something that we're just going to go and play, for instance, Skyrim, and suddenly be able to take advantage of all this fancy ray tracing. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So the moral of the story is that gamers are upset about the GeForce RTX 20 series because they look very expensive, and gamers are skeptical as to whether the performance increase can justify the price increases. And again, that remains to be seen. But if this slide from Nvidia is any indication, then I think these cards are on track to hit that target. The other broader context of this uproar, why gamers are so upset over this pricing, is twofold. One is that it's been quite a while since Nvidia put out a new generation of graphics cards, like I said, over 2.5 years. Or over 2 years, not quite 2.5, but getting close. It will be about 2.5, I guess, by the time it comes out. Anyway, so these cards are hotly anticipated, and there's a lot of people like myself that would really love to upgrade this round. And then there was just a certain amount of sticker shock when these prices were announced. The other aspect of it is that AMD, who is the other major manufacturer, designer of GPUs, graphics cards, has not been very competitive in the high-end graphics card arena for a while, and all indications suggest that they're not going to be for quite some time, or maybe never again. I don't know. Not to, speak down on AMD or AMD fans. And competition's a great thing. Like, I want AMD to be competitive in the high-end graphics card space, but they're just not right now. And it doesn't look like they're going to be. So a lot of gamers are looking at these price increases by Nvidia on these RTX 20 series as price gouging, as Nvidia milking their monopoly, essentially, and throwing all sense of value out the window with these cards, upcharging because they can. But originally, I thought that too. When I saw the pricing initially, I was like, this is outrageous. These cards are way overpriced. This is Nvidia being just big jerks because they can, because they have the upper hand. But now that I've run the numbers, I've kind of come around on that, and I do think that they'll probably be able to hit those required generation over generation performance increases to justify this generation over generation price increase, regardless of whether ray tracing is all it's cracked up to be, or whether this first generation, these early adopter ray tracing cards, whether that technology turns out to have any real value in the near term or in the useful lifespan of these cards. Regardless, just in terms of raw performance, I think for the RTX 2070 and 2080, they'll probably hit that target for, to keep that value reasonable. Anyway, I'm basically rambling at this point, but of course, the very bottom line to all this is wait until the cards are out. Wait for reviews. You don't need to pre-order. I know it's exciting to have the newest technology right away, but if you wait, you're not going to be caught on off guard. You're not going to get ripped off if that's what's happening here. And if it turns out they are great cards, then hey, pick them up when they're available. That's my recommendation. I know that not everyone abides by that or works that way, but that's of course my recommendation here. We'll see if the cards turn out to be really good, and if I can save up some cash, maybe I'll spring for an RTX 2080, but I will wait. I will see what the benchmarks say, the independent benchmarks. But we won't have to wait too much longer. They're coming out, like I said, the 2080 and the 2080 Ti on the 20th of September, and the 2070 will follow in October. So I think that's all I want to say for now. I'm very tired. I don't know if you guys could tell, but it's very, very late for me. And I'm getting a little rambly, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. I would like to hear your take on all this down below in the comments, so feel free to let me know what you think about all this. If you're planning to upgrade anytime soon, if you think these cards look decent, or if they just look like a crazy gimmick, let me know. Alright guys, thanks for listening today. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it relaxing, and look very forward to having you back here next time. Bye for now, guys.